So, how much was your mother's inheritance? Martin's words sliced through the silence, jolting me back to the grim reality. I turned to face him, my heart sinking. Not a word of consolation, no gentle touch or shared sorrow, just a blatant, almost indecent inquiry about money. It was grotesquely inappropriate, especially coming from him, and especially here at my mother's funeral. I stared at him, taken aback, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Martin, is this really the time to— $1 million, wasn't it? He cut me off, his eyes not reflecting the gravity of the moment, but rather a calculating coldness. I sighed, my heart heavy with a grief that was now tinged with bitterness. Yes, around that. But after taxes and everything, it's not as much as you think. Martin hummed noncommittally, a smug smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. That expression, so devoid of empathy, made my stomach churn. This was not the man I had married. Or perhaps he was, and I had just refused to see it. I should have been outraged, incensed. But more than anything, I felt weary. Weary of this charade of a marriage, weary of Martin's callousness. Yet, in that weariness, there was a spark, a burgeoning resolve. I wouldn't let him get away with this, not this time. As I watched him stroll away, already lost in his scheming thoughts, a plan began to take shape in my mind. Martin was naive if he thought he could just waltz in and claim what was mine, what was my mother's. He had underestimated me for far too long. It was time for Martin to learn that I wasn't just a silent spectator in his selfish play. The roles were about to be reversed, and I, Elaine, would be the one to draw the curtain on this act of greed and deceit. Martin and I were married when I was just 22, a match more of convenience than of love. Our families, both prominent in business, saw it as a strategic union. I remember walking down the aisle, feeling more like a pawn in a chess game than a bride. Martin, 5 years my senior, shared my lack of enthusiasm. It was a mutual understanding, unspoken yet palpable. The early years were marked by a lukewarm companionship, but as time wore on, the distance between us grew. The absence of children only widened the chasm. We had tried, initially with hope, then with desperation, and finally with a resigned acceptance that it wasn't meant to be. You should get out more, do something useful, Martin would often say, his words dripping with a subtle, stinging disdain. His indifference to my struggles, to our struggles, was like a slowly tightening noose. It was during these years that the foundation of our already fragile relationship crumbled. Martin's family business, once thriving, fell into disarray. His father's untimely passing in an accident revealed a slew of financial misdoings, tax evasions, debts, a whole web of deceit. The fallout was catastrophic. Assets seized, reputations tarnished, and our once comfortable life shattered into pieces. We managed to hold on to the house, but little else. I watched as Martin's demeanor changed, from aloof to bitter, his pride wounded, his ego bruised, and in his bitterness he became even more detached, leaving me to navigate the storm alone. The following years were a blur of caregiving for Martin's ailing mother. The woman who once looked at me with warmth and affection had grown cold and resentful in her illness. Martin, ever the absent son, left the burden entirely on my shoulders. His visits were brief, his interactions perfunctory. "Elaine, you need to handle this better," he would often say, his tone dismissive, as if the weight of the responsibility was mine alone to bear. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that adversity would bring us closer. Instead, it only highlighted the vast, unbridgeable gap between us. The realization that our marriage was nothing more than a facade was a bitter pill to swallow. But swallow it I did, with a growing resolve that I would not let this be the end of my story. As night fell and the house plunged into darkness, I knew one thing for certain. I could not, would not, let Martin control my fate any longer. The seeds of a plan, sown in anger and watered by years of neglect, were beginning to take root. It was time for Martin to reap what he had sown. As I prepared my morning tea, my mind wandered back to the years that had silently slipped by, each one leaving its mark on my life like the rings of a tree, recording a history of quiet endurance and unspoken sorrow. Those years were defined by a singular, relentless responsibility, caring for Martin's mother. She had suffered a debilitating stroke, transforming her from the once vibrant woman I knew into a shadow of her former self. The weight of her care fell squarely on my shoulders, a burden that Martin seemed all too willing to ignore. "Elaine, why don't you put her in a home? It's too much for you," my friends would suggest, their concern genuine but tinged with a helplessness that mirrored my own. But something held me back, a sense of duty, perhaps, or the faint hope that this sacrifice would somehow mend the fissures in our fractured family. Martin's contributions were limited to occasional cursory visits, each one a painful reminder of the emotional void that lay between us. "You're doing a fine job with Mother," he would comment, a hollow commendation that left me feeling more isolated than ever. It was during this period of prolonged solitude that I received the news of my own mother's passing. The grief was overwhelming, not just for the loss of a beloved parent, but for the realization of how alone I truly was. My inheritance, a sum that should have brought some measure of comfort, only served as a catalyst for Martin's avarice. The day after his crass inquiry about the inheritance, my resolve hardened. I had endured enough. The loveless marriage, the thankless role of a caregiver, the constant belittlement. It was time for a reckoning. As I sipped my tea, staring out at the garden overgrown with neglect, a plan began to crystallize in my mind. If Martin was so eager to claim my inheritance, then let him try. But he would soon learn that I was no longer the passive, compliant wife he had taken for granted. With each passing day as I tended to his mother, I fortified my resolve. I would use the inheritance not as a means to enrich our lives, but as a weapon to reclaim my own. It was a risky, bold move, one that went against everything I had been taught about patience and sacrifice. But I was done waiting, done hoping for a change that would never come. The wheels were already in motion. Martin, blinded by his greed, couldn't see the trap I was laying, and by the time he realized, it would be too late. After years of being underestimated and overlooked, I was finally ready to turn the tables. As I prepared my morning tea, my mind wandered back to the years that had silently slipped by, each one leaving its mark on my life like the rings of a tree, recording a history of quiet endurance and unspoken sorrow. Those years were defined by a singular, relentless responsibility, caring for Martin's mother. She had suffered a debilitating stroke, transforming her from the once vibrant woman I knew into a shadow of her former self. The weight of her care fell squarely on my shoulders, a burden that Martin seemed all too willing to ignore. "Elaine, why don't you put her in a home? It's too much for you," my friends would suggest, their concern genuine, but tinged with a helplessness that mirrored my own. But something held me back. A sense of duty, perhaps, or the faint hope that this sacrifice would somehow mend the fissures in our fractured family. Martin's contributions were limited to occasional, cursory visits, each one a painful reminder of the emotional void that lay between us. "You're doing a fine job with Mother," he would comment, a hollow commendation that left me feeling more isolated than ever. It was during this period of prolonged solitude that I received the news of my own mother's passing. The grief was overwhelming, not just for the loss of a beloved parent, but for the realization of how alone I truly was. My inheritance, a sum that should have brought some measure of comfort, only served as a catalyst for Martin's avarice. The day after his crass inquiry about the inheritance, my resolve hardened. I had endured enough. The loveless marriage, the thankless role of a caregiver, the constant belittlement. It was time for a reckoning. As I sipped my tea, staring out at the garden overgrown with neglect, a plan began to crystallize in my mind. If Martin was so eager to claim my inheritance, then let him try. But he would soon learn that I was no longer the passive, compliant wife he had taken for granted. With each passing day as I tended to his mother, I fortified my resolve. I would use the inheritance not as a means to enrich our lives, but as a weapon to reclaim my own. It was a risky, bold move, one that went against everything I had been taught about patience and sacrifice. But I was done waiting, done hoping for a change that would never come. The wheels were already in motion. Martin, blinded by his greed, couldn't see the trap I was laying. And by the time he realized, it would be too late. After years of being underestimated and overlooked, I was finally ready to turn the tables. The day began like any other, with the quiet routine that had become my life's rhythm. But beneath the calm surface, there was a current of anticipation, a sense of an impending storm that was about to break. It was a few weeks after Martin's crass inquiry about the inheritance. In that time, I had meticulously planned every step, every move. My resolve had only grown stronger, fueled by the years of neglect and emotional abandonment. Then, without warning, the routine was shattered. Martin didn't come home one evening. At first, I thought it was just another late night at work, a common occurrence in his increasingly erratic schedule. But as hours turned into a full day, and then another, worry gave way to suspicion. Had he finally acted on his greed? My suspicions were confirmed when I discovered the documents related to my mother's inheritance were missing. Martin had taken them. It was a bold move, even for him, and it reeked of desperation. The man I had lived with for years, who had rarely shown any initiative or courage, had finally made his move, and it was against me. But instead of panic or fear, I felt a strange sense of liberation. This was the sign I had been waiting for, the catalyst to break free from the shackles of this loveless marriage. I knew Martin thought he had the upper hand, but he was playing a game whose rules I had rewritten. As I began to put my plan into action, another revelation came to light, one that would change everything. Hidden among my mother's papers, which Martin had carelessly overlooked, was a document detailing a substantial investment she had made years ago, an investment that had grown significantly over time. It was a fortune he didn't know existed, and one he couldn't touch. The irony was almost poetic. In his greed, Martin had grabbed at what he thought was a fortune, only to miss the real treasure that lay hidden. And in his haste, he had given me the perfect opportunity to escape the prison of our marriage. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I saw a future that was mine to shape. I would start by securing my newfound wealth, ensuring it was beyond Martin's reach, and then I would confront him, not as the meek wife he thought he knew, but as a woman reborn in the fires of betrayal and hardship. The game had changed, and I was now the one in control. The revelation of the hidden fortune was like a key unlocking a door I had long thought sealed. With Martin's disappearance and his betrayal laid bare, the path forward was clear. It was not just a path of escape, but of justice, a chance to reclaim not only my inheritance, but my dignity. In the days that followed, I moved with a purpose that felt foreign, yet exhilarating. I secured the hidden assets, ensuring they were safely out of Martin's reach. I also initiated the legal proceedings for divorce, a step I had never imagined I would have the strength to take. Then, as unexpectedly as he had vanished, Martin returned. He came back under the guise of reconciliation, feigning concern and remorse. But his eyes gave him away. They were the eyes of a man defeated, not by circumstances, but by his own avarice. "Elaine, I've been a fool," Martin began, his voice laden with a contrived penitence. "Let's put this behind us and start over." Start over? The audacity of the suggestion was almost laughable. After years of indifference, after his brazen theft, he expected forgiveness and a fresh start. It was a testament to how little he understood me, how little he had ever cared to know me. "No, Martin, there's no starting over," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." The shock on his face was palpable, a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization that the woman he thought he could control was gone. In her place stood someone he couldn't manipulate or dismiss. As the legal proceedings unfolded, Martin's true colors were revealed. His attempts to contest the divorce were feeble, his arguments laced with desperation. The man who had once held himself with an air of unearned superiority was now reduced to a pitiable figure, scrambling to salvage whatever scraps he could. The divorce was finalized swiftly, much to Martin's dismay. He was left with little, just the shell of a life he had squandered through his own selfishness. It was a fitting end for a man who had valued wealth over relationships, who had seen his wife as nothing more than a means to an end. In the aftermath, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The chains of a loveless marriage had been broken, and I was free to rebuild my life on my own terms. The fortune I had inherited would ensure my financial security, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self. Martin's fall from grace was a harsh lesson in karma. His greed and betrayal had brought him nothing but ruin, a fate he had crafted with his own hands. As for me, I stepped into a new chapter of my life with a clear conscience and a heart ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I awoke to a world that seemed brighter, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. The air felt fresher, the sounds of the city more vibrant. For the first time in decades, I felt a sense of excitement about the future. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in new experiences. I resumed my long-abandoned hobby of pottery, finding solace in the rhythmic motion of the spinning wheel and the malleable clay in my hands. Each piece I created was a reflection of my journey, imperfect, unique, and brimming with newfound hope. I also reconnected with old friends and made new ones. Their support and companionship filled a void in my life that I hadn't realized was so gaping. We shared stories, laughter, and moments of introspection, reminding me that there was a world beyond the confines of my former marriage. As I rebuilt my life, I often thought of Martin. He had once been a central figure in my world, but now he felt like a distant memory, a chapter that had been firmly closed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had struggled to adjust to his new reality. He had lost his job and, with it, the pretense of the life he had tried so hard to maintain. There was no joy in hearing of his misfortunes. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that his choices had led him to this point. It was a stark reminder that we are the architects of our own fate. In this new chapter of my life, I found joy in the simple pleasures, the warmth of the sun on my face, the laughter of friends, the satisfaction of creating something with my own hands. I also discovered a strength within myself that I hadn't known existed. It was a strength born of adversity, of facing my fears and emerging on the other side. As I sat in my pottery class, shaping a new piece on the wheel, I realized that this was just the beginning. Life, like the clay in my hands, was malleable. It could be shaped and reshaped, and it was never too late to start anew. The journey I had embarked on was not just about moving past a failed marriage or reclaiming my inheritance. It was about rediscovering who I was and what I wanted from life. And with each passing day, I felt more confident, more alive. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. With the lessons of the past etched in my heart and the promise of tomorrow in my eyes, I stepped forward into a world of endless possibilities.